This video surveys historical contexts for the classical period of Western music. It also introduces its viewer to the musical careers of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. The 18th century is known as the Age of Enlightenment. Sparked by the late 17th century ideas of John Locke, Isaac Newton, and others, the Enlightenment solidified around the writings of 18th century individuals such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Benjamin Franklin, and Immanuel Kant. As suggested on the slide in front of you, the Enlightenment stressed the powers of humanity through the use of reason and common sense to improve its condition and provide liberty and justice for all. Aspects of the Enlightenment, such as the emphasis on human accomplishments, can be traced back to the early Renaissance. Reason, of course, was already a watchword of the Baroque period. 18th century thinkers, however, placed a new emphasis on common sense, that is, on basic good human judgment that they presumed all human beings had received at birth. In this way, the Enlightenment was a response to the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, which had sometimes unfortunately been propagated based on the smallest of doctrinal differences. Many Enlightenment thinkers thus sought to lessen the authority of religious traditions and institutions, preferring to emphasize what they saw as universal human rights and goods. They were optimistic that if humankind would simply act with common sense, found in ideas such as the Golden Rule, societies might advance, providing more liberty and justice for all. As that final phrase, taken from the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America, suggests, Enlightenment ideals continue to shape most Western democracies even today. Enlightenment ideals provided inspiration for 18th century political revolutions throughout the Western world. Already in the late 17th century, English revolutions had led Britain to embrace a constitutional democracy. About a century later, the American colonists threw off their British colonizers and established their own democratic republic. The French Revolution, however, probably had the greatest influence on Western classical music. In 1789, French revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, freeing political prisoners of the king. Within the next 5 years, King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, had been sent to the guillotine. A reign of terror had begun in which tens of thousands of so-called enemies of the revolution were put to death throughout France. In 1799, French general Napoleon Bonaparte became the first consul of France. This was the result of a coup d'etat that he himself had helped stage. By 1804, he had declared himself a none too democratic or republican emperor of France, and he embarked on an aggressive campaign to try to bring the rest of Europe under his control. After Napoleon's final demise in 1815, France would go through a series of republics before arguably achieving the democratic ideals of its early revolutionaries in the 1950s. The other revolution of the age was the Industrial Revolution, which began in the 18th century and continued into the 19th century. One trajectory of industrialization is suggested by the images on this screen. Scientific and social developments led to inventions such as the steam engine in the early 18th century. This allowed for the production of more power for factories. Just a few years later, the flying shuttle was patented, which allowed for the weaving of wider swaths of fabrics within such factories. As a result, fabric was woven at less expense, making clothes more affordable for lower and middle-class families. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s automated the process of separating cotton fibers from cotton seeds. This invention also contributed to more fabric and clothes on the market. Fueled by political and industrial revolutions, the middle class was burgeoning. Individuals of the working and middle classes were becoming more and more literate. Newspapers, periodicals, and novels popped up throughout 18th century Western Europe. These sources provide us with reviews of concerts and published music, and they capture 18th century impressions of and responses to its music. Artists and architects of the second half of the 18th century looked to classical antiquity as a model. Their works are referred to as neoclassical. Here, musical terminology diverges from that used by art historians. As we have few musical exemplars from classical antiquity, and as the music of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven would become the model for 19th century and 20th century music, musicians and music historians have referred to the second half of the 18th and early 19th centuries as a time of musical classicism. Neoclassicism in music would have to wait for the 20th century. One might also argue that the music of Haydn, Mozart, and early Beethoven aspires towards a certain noble simplicity and calm grandeur that the 18th century art historian Joachim Winckelmann saw in ancient art, such as in this depiction of Laocoon and his sons. It is also important to recognize the difference between our reference to music of this period as classical music and our broader understanding of classical music as distinguished from folk music or popular music. If classical or art music is music that has stood the test of time and that requires formal musical study, folk music is music of the people that is passed down orally from generation to generation, and popular music is music that is disseminated and embraced by large numbers of people. As the Venn diagram conveys, in some cases, a music composition might display elements of music from classical, popular, and folk categories. The three most important composers of the classical period were Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Their music careers illustrate the changing role of the composer during this time. Haydn worked for the aristocracy for most of his life, composing to order and wearing the livery of his patron, Prince Esterhazy. After he retired in the 1790s, Haydn finally had more freedom to forge his own career and staged concerts for his own commercial benefit in London and Vienna. Mozart was born and raised by a father who was a court musician for the Archbishop of Salzburg. It was expected that Mozart, too, would enter the service of the Archbishop, but instead, he ran off to Vienna, where he attempted to live as a freelancer. After a few initial successes, Mozart struggled to earn enough money to make ends meet and died a pauper in 1791. Beethoven also grew up the son of a court musician, but was sent to Vienna to learn to compose. By 1809, he had secured a lifetime annuity, a promise from local noblemen of annual support. Beethoven didn't have to compose music for them. He simply had to stay in Vienna and compose. In some ways, the role of the aristocratic patron and composer had been turned on its head. Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven all spent large portions of their lives in Vienna. This painting depicts late 18th century Vienna, which might be thought of as the capital of the Western musical world of the time. This slide also concludes the video introduction to musical classicism. Please proceed to videos about classical musical styles, forms, and genres.